Rancho Cordova, California. Summer 1976. A door creaks open. Not broken, not forced, just opened, quietly, like it was expected. A man steps inside. He knows this house. He's known it for days, maybe weeks. He knows which room the bedroom is in. He knows what time the lights go off. He knows because he's been standing outside in the dark, watching, waiting, learning. And in his hand, he's carrying a length of rope. He didn't bring it tonight. He hid it here, days ago, inside this very house, waiting for this exact moment. For the next 10 years, this same scene would repeat itself across California, in different cities, different neighborhoods, different homes. And for the next 40 years, an entire state would fall asleep every night, asking the same
terrifying question: is he in my house tonight? Today, we're telling the story of one of the most prolific, most calculated, and most elusive serial predators in American history, a man who hunted for over a decade and who, for most of that time, wore a police badge. Welcome to Murdrix TV. His name was Joseph James DeAngelo, Jr., born November 8, 1945, in Bath, New York. On paper, there was nothing remarkable about him. A Vietnam War veteran, a former Navy man, later in life described by those who knew him as unremarkable, forgettable, the kind of guy you'd avoid at a family dinner, not because he seemed dangerous, but because he seemed boring. One prosecutor who worked his case later wrote that DeAngelo reminded him of a sloppy grandpa or an alcoholic.
Uncle, someone you wouldn't look at twice. But behind that ordinary face was a man who, according to investigators, had spent his entire adult life craving one thing above all else: power, control, the ability to make other human beings feel as small and as helpless as he once felt. Prosecutors would later say that DeAngelo's childhood may hold a clue. As a boy, he reportedly witnessed his younger sister, only 8 or 9 years old, being assaulted by 2 military servicemen while he was held down and forced to watch. His parents, investigators say, beat him regularly. Whatever the cause, by his 20s, DeAngelo had chosen a profession that gave him exactly what he wanted: authority. From 1973 to 1976, he served as a police officer in the small town of Exeter, California. He knew the law. He knew how investigations worked. He knew how long it took for backup to arrive, where roadblocks would be set up, and, most dangerously, exactly how to disappear before anyone could catch him. And it was during this very period, while working as a sworn police officer in nearby Exeter, that he committed his first known murder, though not, as far as the record shows, while on duty or in uniform. On September 11, 1975, a ski-masked intruder broke into the home of a vocal journalism professor named Claude Snelling in Visalia, attempting to abduct his 16-year-old daughter from her bedroom. Snelling woke, ran outside, and confronted the masked man in the carport. He was shot twice and died shortly after. According to the Visalia police chief, the weapon used had itself been stolen during one of the earlier ransacker burglaries, not notably a police-issued firearm. As the assailant fled, prosecutors say he kicked Snelling's daughter 3 times in the face, leaving her on the ground. Decades later, DNA and investigative work would tie this killing to Joseph DeAngelo, a police officer working in a town just 10 miles away, who had just become a killer, and almost no one knew it yet. Before he became known by the name that would eventually terrify all of California, DeAngelo was first known by a different one, the Visalia Ransacker. Around Visalia, a town just 10 miles from Exeter, a mysterious burglar began breaking into homes, dozens and dozens of them. Investigators would eventually count more than 120 burglaries tied to this phase of his crimes. He wasn't just stealing, he was ransacking, tossing rooms, taking small personal items, sometimes leaving strange, unsettling signs that he had been there. It was almost as if he was rehearsing, testing his own limits, learning what he could get away with. And then, in 1976, something changed. The burglar disappeared from Visalia. A new predator was about to be born, 200 miles away, in Sacramento. June 18, 1976.
Rancho Cordova, a quiet suburb of Sacramento. A man broke into the home of a woman who lived alone and assaulted her. It was the first of what would become one of the most horrifying crime waves in California history. Over the next 3 years, investigators would link this same man to at least 38 separate attacks across Sacramento and
Stockton. The press gave him a name, the East Area Rapist. His method was terrifyingly precise. He didn't choose victims at random. He would stalk them for days, sometimes weeks, learning their schedules, their habits, the layout of their homes. He would break in ahead of time while no one was there and hide lengths of twine in the house that he would later use to bind his victims. He would unlock windows in advance so that when he returned, entry would be silent and effortless. At first, he targeted women who lived alone, but as the attacks continued, his pattern grew even more sadistic. He began targeting couples. He would tie up the male partner first. Then, in an act of calculated psychological torture, he would stack a small pile of dishes on the man's back and issue
chilling threat. If I hear those plates move, I'll kill you both. Then, for hours, he would repeatedly assault the woman while her partner lay frozen beneath a stack of rattling porcelain, terrified that a single sound could get them both killed. One survivor, Jane Carson Sandler, was attacked in her own bed in 1976 while her 3-year-old son slept beside her. Decades later, she would tell a courtroom, "I was frozen in fear beyond description. My attention was not on the rape, but fully on, where did you put my son when you removed him from the bed?" Another couple, Bob and Gay Hardwick, were attacked together in their Stockton home in 1978. Gay Hardwick later said the trauma of that single night stayed with her for over 40 years, calling it, in her words, a life
sentence for someone who didn't deserve to serve it. And it wasn't only the attacks themselves that terrorized the region. DeAngelo would sometimes call his victims, weeks, months, even years later, just to remind them he was still out there, still watching. By 1978, some of his earliest victims were receiving threatening phone calls promising to kill them. Those calls, chillingly, continued for decades, some reportedly as late as 2001. Then, on February 2, 1978, his violence escalated to something new. A couple, Brian and Katie Maggiore, were walking their dog in Rancho Cordova when they were shot and killed. It would take investigators nearly 40 years to connect this double murder to the East Area Rapist. By mid-1979, the attacks had spread even further, into the Bay Area, with reported assaults in Concord, San Jose, Danville, Fremont, and Walnut Creek. And then, just as suddenly as he'd escalated, he moved again, this time south. October 1, 1979, Goleta, near Santa Barbara. A new wave of terror begins, this time 500 kilometers south of Sacramento. An intruder broke into a couple's home and tried to bind them, just like before. But this time, a neighbor heard screaming, and he was forced to flee before completing the attack. It wouldn't be his last attempt. Over the next 7 years, this same man, now dubbed the original Night Stalker, would go on to murder at least 10 more people across Santa Barbara, Ventura, and Orange counties. His attacks grew more violent, more final. Where he once tied up and raped his victims, now increasingly left them dead. The murders were brutal, methodical, and terrifyingly similar in pattern. Victims bound, homes searched, personal items taken as trophies. Wedding rings, photographs, small mementos of the lives he had just destroyed. For years, investigators in Southern California had no idea they were hunting the same man responsible for the terror up north. 2 different names, 2 different task forces, 1 killer, moving freely between them. The violence finally seemed to stop after 1981. 5 years of silence followed. Then, in 1986, 18-year-old Janelle Cruz was found raped and beaten to death in her own home in Irvine. It would be the last known murder attributed to him. And then, he vanished. No more attacks, no more phone calls, no more. Sightings. For the first time in over a decade, California could breathe, but no one knew why he'd stopped. Was he dead, in prison for some other crime, or was he simply waiting?
The years turned into decades. Detectives who had worked the case retired. Some died, still not knowing who the man behind the mask really was. Boxes of evidence sat in storage, gathering dust in evidence rooms across 6 different California counties. Then, in 2001, a breakthrough. DNA testing revealed something investigators had long suspected but never been able to prove. The East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same person. 2 names, 2 decades of terror, 1 killer. The combined case was now called Eron's, but the world would come to know him by a new name, coined
Later, by a determined true crime writer named Michelle McNamara. McNamara wasn't a detective. She wasn't law enforcement. She was a writer with an obsession, spending countless hours combing through case files, interviewing retired investigators, building her own private map of the crimes. She gave the killer the name that would finally stick in the public imagination, the Golden State Killer. She poured years of her life into tracking him, convinced that somewhere in the mountain of old evidence was the key to finally identifying him. She was working on a book about the case, a book she would never see published. In 2016, Michelle McNamara died suddenly, her manuscript unfinished. Her husband and researchers completed it using her notes. The book, titled I'll Be Gone in the
Dark, was published posthumously in 2018, and in an almost unbelievable twist of fate, just 2 months after her book hit shelves, police arrested the Golden State Killer. By December 2017, a small team of investigators, led by Detective Paul Holes and FBI attorney Steve Kramer, had begun trying something no one had successfully used before to catch a serial killer of this scale: investigative genetic genealogy. The idea was radical in its simplicity. Take the killer's own DNA, recovered decades earlier from crime scenes, and upload it not into a police database, but into a public genealogy website, the same kind of website ordinary people use to build their family trees or find long-lost relatives. The DNA didn't match the killer directly. Killers rarely do. But it
matched someone else, a distant relative, several branches removed on the family tree. From there, investigators began the painstaking work of building out an entire family tree by hand, cross-referencing age, location, and other known details about the suspect. Branch by branch, name by name, the tree narrowed. And at the very end of it, one name stood out: Joseph James DeAngelo, a 72-year-old retired mechanic, living quietly in Citrus Heights, a peaceful Sacramento suburb. A grandfather, a neighbor who mowed his lawn and waved at people on the street. To confirm it, investigators needed his DNA directly, but they couldn't simply walk up and ask a suspected serial killer for a sample. According to multiple published accounts, investigators covertly collected a discarded item
bearing DeAngelo's DNA. Reports describe a sample lifted from his car door handle, followed by a second sample recovered from a tissue in his curbside trash. The exact sequence has been described slightly differently across outlets, but the outcome was the same. The sample was sent to the lab. It was compared against decades-old DNA recovered from Golden State Killer crime scenes. They matched. 40 years, 51 law enforcement agencies, over 1 million pages of case files, and in the end, it came down to a car door handle and a tissue in the trash. April 24, 2018, a quiet street in Citrus Heights. Police surrounded a small suburban house, the home of a man his own neighbors described as unremarkable, even boring. Joseph DeAngelo, 72 years old, was arrested without
incident. According to prosecutors, DeAngelo left alone in an interrogation room and, apparently unaware he was still being recorded, was heard speaking quietly to himself. Different outlets have reported his words slightly differently, some quoting him as saying, "I did all those things," others as, "I did that." Prosecutors have said he went on to seem to place blame for his crimes on some kind of alternate identity, with reported lines including, "He made me. I didn't have the strength to push him out. I pushed Jerry out and had a happy life." These are not verbatim court transcripts, but statements as characterized by prosecutors and reported by news outlets. In a detail that comes from lead prosecutor Theon Ho's own book on the case, detectives at one point reportedly offered DeAngelo a can of Dr. Pepper, the same drink he had allegedly left behind at multiple crime scenes decades earlier. According to Ho's account, DeAngelo never touched it. apparently wary of leaving DNA behind, unaware, if true, that investigators already had his DNA from his trash. Since his arrest, the same genetic genealogy technique used to catch DeAngelo has gone on to help identify more than 150 other suspects in cold cases across the country, a method born entirely out of the hunt for one man. On June 29, 2020, Joseph DeAngelo stood in a Sacramento courtroom, converted into a makeshift space large enough to allow social distancing, and pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and 13 counts of kidnapping to commit robbery. As part of the plea deal, he also admitted to a staggering 161 additional uncharged crimes involving 61 victims, including rapes that could never be legally prosecuted, simply because California's statute of limitations on those crimes had long since expired. In exchange, prosecutors took the death penalty off the table. DeAngelo would spend the rest of his life in prison without any possibility of parole. But the story didn't end with a plea deal. It ended with something far more powerful. From August 18th to August 20th, 2020, nearly 36 survivors and family members of victims stood in that same courtroom, some of them waiting over 40 years for this exact moment, and spoke directly to the man who had destroyed their lives. Jane Carson Sandler, the woman attacked in front of her 3-year-old son, back in 1976, told the court that scars from that night never fully healed. She said even now, decades later, the sight of a ski mask or the sound of someone shouting, "Shut up," could trigger overwhelming anxiety. But she also said something else, something defiant. "My comfort at those times is remembering that you are finally going to prison and will remain there until you die." Another survivor, Chris Pedretti, one of DeAngelo's earliest victims, told the court she refused to be defined by what happened to her. "He didn't win," she said. "I'm not a lost girl." Pedretti had gone on to become a source of strength for other survivors, organizing potluck dinners after DeAngelo's court appearances, starting a support group for sexual assault survivors that would eventually grow to hundreds of members. Then, on the final day, DeAngelo, who had sat silently in a wheelchair, his face covered by a mask throughout the proceedings, did something no one expected. He rose to his feet. He removed his mask, and in a slow, halting voice, he spoke directly to the people he had spent decades terrorizing. "I've listened to all your statements, each one of them, and I'm truly sorry to everyone I have hurt." He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In total, Joseph James DeAngelo admitted to 161 crimes involving 48 known victims, 13 of which were murders he could actually be charged for, decades after the statute of limitations had erased any chance of prosecuting the rest. He had worn a badge. He had used the law to learn how to break it. And for over 40 years, he had lived freely among the very communities he had terrorized, a quiet neighbor, a forgettable face in the crowd. In the end, it wasn't a confession, a witness, or a lucky break that finally caught him. It was a distant cousin's decision to upload their DNA to a genealogy website, looking for nothing more than a piece of their own family history, never imagining they were about to hand investigators the final piece of one of the most notorious manhunts in American history. The Golden State Killer case changed forensic investigation forever. The technique that finally caught him, genetic genealogy, is now used in cold cases across the entire world, giving families answers that once seemed impossible. But at its heart, this was never just a story about DNA or detectives or breakthroughs. It was about the survivors, the ones who waited decades, the ones who refused to let one man's cruelty define the rest of their lives. It's a reminder of something uncomfortable but important. Sometimes, the most dangerous people don't look dangerous at all. They look like your neighbor, your coworker, the quiet man who waves at you while mowing his lawn. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure to subscribe to the channel, because next time we're uncovering another case the world tried to forget. Murdrix TV, stories that are real.